Como son las 7:05, yo creo que podemos partir. Y mientras tanto se irá sumando gente.
Okay.
Welcome everyone. This is the third version of our international webinar series, Partners in Research. Today we're very lucky to have Professor Paul Gertler from Berkeley University and my colleague Raimundo Undurraga. Both of them are going to be talking about a very important, very relevant, and very current topic, which is why public policies fail and what we can do about that in particular. I'm going to do a very brief introduction of both of them. First, Raimundo is an assistant professor at the Industrial Engineering Department of our university, University of Chile. He obtained his PhD in public administration at NYU, at New York University. Most of his research is focused on development economics and also on urban economics. Joining Raimundo is Professor Paul Gertler. He is the Li Ka-shing Professor of Economics at the University of California at Berkeley. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Wisconsin and other positions such as being the faculty director for the Institute for Business and Social Impact. He's also the scientific director for the Center for Effective Global Action. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Development Engineering. And in terms of his research areas, a lot of his attention or focus goes into the area of impact evaluation applied to a number of fields, including health economics, financial inclusion, poverty alleviation, labor markets, early childhood development, and education. So with that, I would like to welcome Paul and Raimundo, and so that they can take the floor and begin this interesting discussion on why public policies fail.
Well, thank you very much, Andres, and all people that have had the opportunity to come to this talk. I would like to share some slides just as a guiding instrument of this talk. I don't know if everyone can see this. Can you see well?
Yes.
Perfect. So as you see here, the title is not exactly the same title that promoted Andres. We changed it a little bit to how can research influence policy, okay? And this is basically because, I mean, even though we appreciate the originality of the title, Why Public Policies Fail, it resembles Acemoglu and Robinson's book, Why Nations Fail, right? Which I think it's a very large question to answer in just 45 minutes, as we will do it today. So I think that question would be a little bit ambitious for our capacity. Of course, determining why public policies fail requires a lot of experience, and not only a lot of experience, but also a lot of knowledge and multiple disciplines beyond economics. And what we're going to do today is just to tell a little bit some stories that Paul and I have been accumulating along our long-term partnership in research. And through those stories, try to illuminate some of the potential reasons that could affect the destiny of a public policy, okay, even to success, or I mean, either to success or to fail, right? So first of all, we see this conversation as this seminar as a colloquial conversation. We would like to interact with the public, and for that, Paul and I will try to have a conversation, pretty much like a podcast, if you want. And then in the middle, if you have any questions, you can just raise your hands and try to get into the conversation. So we can have together a dialogue that is productive to everyone. Okay. So we will start with with the classical definition of what's public policy in the textbook. I mean, if you open any textbook of organizational economics, if you look at any textbook of public administration, you typically will observe this figure that you see in the slide. Okay? So you have that public policies are typically defined as a flow of different steps, as a cycle, where first of all, you have a formulation of the problem that the policy wants to solve, typically related with the needs of the intended population. Then you have a step that consists on designing a policy that will solve those needs, right? And then you have the classical implementation of this policy, right? And sometimes also you have a step of evaluation where you see whether the intended objective of this policy, whether the design actually meets or not its initial intended objectives, right? And then with those results in hand, you can then go back to the initial step and reformulate either the needs or the population that you want to treat, and eventually also that will end in a redesign of the problem of the program or the policy, and then to implement that policy and so on and so forth. You know, this is the textbook public policy. We call that because it's typically what you observe in this literature, right? Now, if you go to the real world, public policies, you will realize quickly that this is mostly about politics. Okay, so public policies, textbook public policies, are not the real world, and in practice, what you usually observe is a process of formulation, implementation, reformulation, re-implementation, and so on and so forth. It is rare to find a rational process of design social programs, and when they do that, typically is not well informed by rigorous evidence. So in that sense, in the real world, we would say that this is pretty much about politics, and the type of diagram that we would like to show you now is a diagram where the researchers can anticipate what's the political economy of this cycle, how politics enter into the design and implementation of public policies, and every researcher in the real work should try to influence that process in an informed way. We as a researcher with Paul have dedicated our career, especially Paul, who have much more experience than I, and I have learned a lot of him. We pretty much try to influence policy by doing research and try to convince politicians and policymakers on what works and what doesn't, and why, especially what are the mechanisms that makes a policy successful or fail. Okay, this is just an introduction to tell you that in some way it is not an easy story to tell. Okay? Talking about failure policies is typically a multidimensional story, right? There are typically many potential reasons that might explain why public policies fail. And we will do here just a list of potential reasons. This is not a complete list, it's just a simple list that we deliver. And we could start, for example, thinking that sometimes public policies can fail because policymakers, priors, that is what they believe is the world, actually is not the world. Okay? So they believe that the necessities of people that their programs want to attend are actually not the real necessities of those intended beneficiaries of the policies, right? And why that happens? Well, typically that happens because policymakers and typically politicians usually lives in their own world, you know, and they are not horizontally connected with the real necessities of people. Or if they are, they may have a biased perception of what are those needs in practice, right? So that's why we first say that it is so important to integrate the civil society in the decision-making process, try to break this politics, technician, society divide, right? And also at the same time, a very key element of successful public policies is piloting public policy, right? You would like to first test in a small group of people whether your original design of the policy is actually working in the intended direction or not, right? And then if you find that it's not working on the intended direction, then you can fix some parts of the policy and can re-implement it in a more successful way. So that would be the ideal world, right? Typically, as I presented you in the previous slide, that's not the real world. And what we'll try to do in this lecture is try to push this debate to what politicians and policymakers, and especially researchers, should try to do jointly in order to get successful public policy. So one classical example of why not piloting can lead to a failure in a public policy is Transantiago. We know that experience very well. Transantiago was launched from one day to the next without piloting, and we know how catastrophic was that experience for many people living in metropolitan region. Okay, a good exception, that is policies that were gradually implemented over time, that are also from the context of Chile, is, for example, the Reforma Procesal Penal, which started at the beginning of 2000 in just 2 regions of the country, and then the justice system started to learn how to improve this system gradually until it was scaled up to the entire country, right? Now, Paul, of course, have much more experience than I, and I think maybe, Paul, you can tell us a little bit your experience in Mexico, especially taking into account this importance of piloting policies before implementing. Paul.
Thanks, Raimundo, and afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here or to be there. I would prefer to have a real Pisco rather than a virtual Pisco, but we do the best we can. I've been doing this for about 30 years, both as an academic, but also I was chief economist for human development at the World Bank. So I interacted a lot with policymakers and governments in terms of trying to improve public policy. And my agenda was really to try and make or encourage governments to use evidence-based policies, so to try and make decisions on evidence. And there are a couple of good examples of why governments rejected that approach. One is, and I'll start even long before I started working in Mexico, but really in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the world was trying to react to the AIDS epidemic. And so we didn't have good treatments or vaccines back then. And most of the interventions to reduce the transmission of AIDS were behavioral change, a lot like a lot of what we're trying to do to prevent the COVID epidemic from expanding is behavioral change in terms of social distancing and mask use. Now, one one thing that politicians really have on the top of their mind when they're making policy is the need to act now, the need to demonstrate I'm doing something. And they have a very short, tend to have a very short horizon. So my experiences in most countries, ministers last about 18 months, and they get around to trying to figure out what they want to do 6 to 8 months in. So they have very little time to execute. And when you talk about piloting or you talk about generating evidence, it's, oh, I can't do that. I don't have to do enough time. People are suffering. I need to act now. And so lots of times you end up with, as Raimundo said, policies that don't work. And in the AIDS epidemic, it was completely tragic. So I was on a panel in Manila at the Asian Development Bank, and I'm sitting there with this high level, I think in English we would say a muckety muck high-level official from the World Health Organization, and we're talking about various responses. He says, forget those things. Give us $2 billion. What we'll do is we'll develop an education program that will convince everybody that they need to use condoms and use clean needles. Don't worry about it. And we can't do this testing alternatives because people are going to die. So we need to move today. And much of the world at that point just invested heavily in the World Health Organization's educational intervention. And for 20 years, there was no evaluation of their education policies until the middle of the last decade. And there were 3 randomized trials, one in Latin America and Brazil, one in Uganda and Africa, another in Thailand. And what they showed was that this education intervention of the World Health Organization led to substantial improvements in terms of knowledge about the transmission of AIDS, but no change in behavior. And so we lost 20 years and millions of lives by sticking to an intervention that people through common wisdom thought would work, but in the field didn't work. And if we'd done the piloting early on in the 1980s and 1990s, we could have saved a lot of lives. But political patience is very thin, and the imperative to act now, even if I don't know what I'm doing, many times overwhelms the necessity or the value of evidence-based policy. And I'll give you an example from Latin America. One study we did in Mexico and another in Argentina. I'll let you guess which one failed to influence policy. Surprise, it's Argentina. In Mexico, we were asked by a state government and the central government to look at a program where the government went in and replaced dirt floors with cement floors in order to break the transmission of parasitic and infectious diseases. And the idea is that if you have a dirt floor, fecal matter, so stomach parasites come from ingesting fecal matter. Fecal matter gets on the floors, dirt floors, from loose diapers or animals or on your shoes. It's hard to see, and it's hard to clean up. Young children especially play on the floor, get their hands in the dirt and put their hands in their mouth, and they're very likely to get parasites on dirt floors. And so the thought was a very cost-effective housing improvement, which was replacing cement floors where you can see fecal matter and clean it up, would work. So we worked with that state government. We did an evaluation. We showed dramatic reduction in parasitic infestations, reductions in diarrhea, improvements in height, and improvements in cognitive development. Why? Well, parasites like to eat micronutrients, one of which is iron, and iron affects brain development. And so Piso-Ferme was a massive success. And the government scaled it up from this one state where they did 30,000 houses to 3 million houses nationwide. In Argentina, we did an evaluation there about water shortages in municipalities. And the thought was, well, maybe if we privatize municipal water and sanitation, the private firms can get capital from international financial markets and invest in the infrastructure, because Argentina has a financial crisis every 10 years, whether it needs it or not, and has trouble borrowing. So maybe the private sector can get access to the capital. So it turns out they did. We saw water quality and water access improve and a big reduction in infant mortality. But when we went to the government, to a new government, and said, look, here's this study, you should not renationalize. There are big health reasons for you to continue to offer water and sanitation services through the private sector. The government completely rejected it. Well, in Argentina, the study came out of me and another co-author sitting in a cafe in the Recollecta trying to figure out how to do an academic paper. And once we did it, we went to the government, and the government didn't care what we said. They weren't interested. They were interested in renationalizing for political reasons, and our study was just inconvenient. Whereas in Mexico, the government wanted to make a decision. It was actively considering the cement floor intervention. And there, because we did it with them ex ante, we worked out the questions they wanted. Our analysis answered the questions they wanted to do and informed what they were interested in. And so the politics of Mexico with the piso firme intervention really fed into the political process there. In Argentina, our analysis was outside the political process. It was after they had already made a decision, and they didn't want to talk to us because they thought our work would make them look bad. So politics were central in both this and the AIDS intervention. So I'll stop rambling and turn it back to Raimundo.
I think I was muted. Thank you, Paul. I think your examples are also connected with the next reason, which is basically that public policies could fail because they are not properly evaluated. So we think that something is going to work in practice. I find that beneficiaries are happy with the policy, or I find that that people are not complaining against the policy, and I believe that the policy is working well. But in practice, as far as you're not evaluating your policy, that could not be the case. So the intended objective of these policies need to be tested in the field in order to really check whether they are working in the intended direction or not. So our second recommendation is the importance, of course, of evaluating public policies. And after evaluating public policies, try to get those results, make productive of them, and try to redesign the programs if required, right? Typically, the redesign of programs could imply a major change in the program, or could imply just some little changes that will improve gradually the quality of the service that the program delivers. It's going to depend on each context. But this is important, especially because policymakers and politicians, as well as researchers, could have some biases regarding the perception of the effectiveness of a given policy, okay? So even though I am very informed on certain literature, I could expect that X or Y program is not working in the intended direction when in fact it is working very well, or vice versa, right? So one textbook example is the case of minimum wage. If you go to any text in economics 10 years or 15 years ago, you would find that increasing the minimum wage will increase the unemployment in a given city or in a given economy, right? However, there is plenty of evidence, empirical evidence, and rigorous evidence showing that that's not necessarily the case, right? So in that sense, our second recommendation, and it seems obvious, but it is very important to mention it, is that in order to guarantee that policies are working in the intended direction, we need to evaluate them. Okay. Good. Another important reason of why public policies might be failing is the lack of political sustainability. There could be some intertemporal inconsistency in the political cycle. So there is a change in the government, and a certain policy that was working very, very well suddenly is interrupted because someone else thought that policy was not working well. Okay, so it is very important that this type of policies, or any type of policy, get some level of consensus across the political spectrum, so that you get political commitment that this policy is going to improve over time, gradually, government after government. Okay? There should be a shared vision of sustainability of public policy. A very recent example that could be failing because of this reason is the Pensión Garantizada Universal that the actual government is proposing, right? There is a debate there whether this new policy, this new pension policy, actually has or not enough funding to fund the new pension, the new Pensión Garantizada Universal. So if there is not political consensus on that, delivering this policy in the actual government could eventually generate a problem for the next government, right? So ideally, we would like as citizens that politicians get some level of minimum agreement of what should these policies continue to be over time, so that when there is a change in the government, these policies are not interrupted. Or if you are ending your government, you're not throwing a new policy that is costly and that the next government will not have funding to sustain. So those kind of situations are very important. For example, now Paul and I are working on evaluating some renting subsidies in slums in Chile. You know, slums in Chile have been growing considerably after the pandemic. A lot of new slums have been created after the pandemic. And so the state in general do not have enough resources to fund private houses for everyone. It's very costly, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of time, getting people out of the slum in the formal housing sector. So in that sense, we are trying now to design a rental subsidy that allows people to have recently come to live to slums. That is, those slum dwellers who have a very long experience living in slums, that probably were allegados previous to the pandemic, and now are living in a slum because they don't have enough economic resources to sustain themselves. We're trying to see if the government could provide them a sort of rental housing subsidy, so that they can temporarily get out of the slums and improve their housing conditions, and eventually get out from the informal world that could in some way trap their living conditions for a longer time after the pandemic. And we have designed a large experiment to test these subsidios de arriendo, and this government have been quite generous and quite open to trying to understand whether this new policy actually works in practice or not. However, we don't know what would happen in the next government. We don't know if these kind of ideas are going to persist or not. So there could be a large effort of partnership between researchers and policymakers in a given government. But if you change the government, then the next administration may not continue that partnership, and that could, of course, lead to a cut of a knowledge process that is important to gradually improve the public policy. Okay, I'm sure that Paul have, again, in the case of Mexico, good examples on this dimension. Paul.
So in 1997, I took a phone call from Mexico, from then the head of DPRES, the budget director, Mexican DPRES, the budget director, a guy named Santiago Levy. And he asked me to come to a meeting to help think about a new program. And this new program, then called Progressa, later on called Oportunidades. The idea was that this government wanted to break the intergenerational transmission of poverty through a conditional cash transfer program. And the idea was we'll give families money if they invest in the human capital of their children, education, health, nutrition, things like that. And the idea was, well, there may be not that much that we can do for the currently poor, but if we improve the human capital of the children of the currently poor, then as the Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen said, they will have the capabilities to take advantage of labor market opportunities and pull themselves out of poverty. And I said, well, that's really innovative. I'd love to, what do you want to learn? What's the purpose of this study? And what's interesting was Santiago said, well, the problem in Mexico is that we elect a new government every 6 years. And no matter what the last government did, the new government says it was shit, we're going to shut it down and design new policies. And he said the issue was that this conditional cash transfer program was all about sustained investment in children for 10, 15, 20 years, not just 1 or 2 years. And the real benefit would come after children became adults and entered the labor market. Did they have better earnings? Did they pull themselves out of poverty? And he said, so we have this political issue that the program, if it looks like it's being effective, that we need it to be sustained across political administrations. And what we want to do is develop a very rigorous evaluation so that if the program is working, it will be very hard for the next government to close it, right? They'll have to close it in the face of this rigorous evaluation, and we'll make all that information public, and the newspapers will have it, and so they have to answer questions. Okay. So we worked with them to develop an evaluation, and we were going to work with 500 communities, 24,000 households, and we said, okay, we'd like to generate some control groups, and what that means is we're going to randomize. We're going to randomize some of the communities to get it first and other communities to get it later. It's, oh, no, we can't do that. That's unethical. How can you use randomization? How can you deny benefits to someone who's eligible? So, okay, forget randomization for now. Do you have enough money and administrative ability to give it to everybody who's eligible today? And they said, no, we had planned to scale it up over a 3 to 5 year period because, we're going to restructure other programs to create the fiscal space and the budget. We have to learn how to do these things. So we're going to scale it up over time. So then we said, okay, which communities are going to get it first and which communities are going to get it later? And one of them said, we're in a closed room with no microphones. One of them said, well, we're going to go to the areas where we had areas first, where we got the greatest percentage vote in order to reward our political supporters. And I said, okay. Are you willing to make that public, that you're giving benefits to people who voted for you? No, we can't do that. That would make us look bad. So I said, well, what other criteria? Someone said, well, why don't we go to the poorer areas first? And so the question is, well, do you have an income survey or a survey where you can really differentiate between the poor and the non-poor? They said no. So I said, well, given you can't measure relative eligibility based on poverty, why don't you just give everybody an equal chance of going first? And then you can explain to the population that we're being fair by running a lottery, and everybody knows what a lottery is and understands the fairness of lotteries. They said, that's great. We won't randomize, but we'll use a lottery instead. And so the idea behind this was we explained how to randomize and explain to the public that it was the right operational thing to do, it was the ethical thing to do, and it fit within their objective function. So we randomized, we followed these 24,000 households for a couple of years. We found that that children, there was low birth weight fell, that the number of kids in school went up, that nutritional status went up, that parents used some of the money to invest in more cows and chickens, leading to higher earnings. We found all along, really, after a couple of years, that the effect of the program were really seeming to improve the lives of the beneficiaries. And this was a large number of people. It was 20% of the Mexican population, and it was over half the federal government for social programs. So it was huge. So after about 2 years, there's a new election. And for the first time, the PRI-LOST, the political party that had been in power since the establishment of the democracy, lost power. And the conservative government, PAN, was elected. And this was the vice president for Coca-Cola. What was his name? The tall guy. Well, in any event, there's a new president from the Conservative Party. So we go in, we present the results to them. There's a big write-up in the newspaper. We are interviewed on television. At least my Mexican counterparts were. I think they kept the gringo as far away as possible from the press. And the advisor to the new government said, it's very impressive. It would be important not to continue this program, but we made promises in our political campaign that this program was bad and needed to be replaced. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to close Progresa, close Oportunidades, but we're going to create a new program that has the same benefit structure, the same beneficiaries, the same targeting mechanism. But we're going to make this very important change. We're going to change the name from Progresa to Oportunidades. And so in this way, we'll be able to claim credit that it's a new program, but substantively, we'll still get the benefits that you guys found. And so they found a political way to politically sustain the program across administrations. And here, what we did was try and work within the political reality of how these people have to make decisions and the pressure they're under, but find a way for them to claim credit and use the evidence to improve people's lives.
Thank you, Paul. I think that example also will lead us in the next couple of slides to start talking about the importance of institutionalizing the process of evaluation within governments. But before that, there is one final reason that is very typical in the context of developing countries of why public policies could fail, which is basically the lack of human and economic or infrastructure resources for a successful implementation of public policy. And here we have many examples, but maybe Paul, you can tell us a little bit the case of Argentina, a country that implemented a reform of decentralization of the school systems. And then we can also talk about the ongoing DPRES and Telecomper project on improving public procurement.
So decentralization of public services, especially in health and education and maybe water and sanitation services, has been a process that's been going, or a public policy, which is being pushed for the last 20, 30 years. The idea that local governments have more information about the needs of local citizens so they can better design program tailored to local needs. The problem is they may not have the capability to take those decisions, or they may be captured by local elites. And so it just exacerbates corruption issues. So Argentina decided to decentralize the administration of its school system from the central governments to local governments. And we did some evaluation of that. And what we found was the decentralization really improved test scores and enrollment in middle income and wealthy areas where they had strong systems of government. But poorer areas that had weaker governments, things got worse. And so it led to an increase in inequality in Argentina. And Argentina would have needed to strengthen school systems in poorer areas to make that policy work. And this is just a risk with decentralization programs, that you can lose all the benefits of bottom-up planning by inept governments.
Interesting. So just to sum up, if we would have to summarize our intuition about why public policies could fail, Paul and I were discussing this a couple of days ago, and we come up with two answers, two short answers, and then a final one. The first short answer is public policies fail because we do not consider the political economy of public. I mean, the political system and all the interests surrounding the interest groups, when those interests are not considered, typically we face this type of political instability of the policies, as well as a reluctance to self-evaluate or to use piloting process in order to pre-test the effectiveness of the policies. So when we do not consider the political economy of these processes, then there is a clear mismatch between the interests of all the parts that are involved within this process. On one side, the beneficiaries; on the other one, the politicians; on the other one, the policymakers. And typically, the researchers are looking this from the outside of the scene. And the second short answer is because we lack rigorous evaluation of public policy. I mean, we don't have a culture of evidence-based public policies. We do not know what is working, what is not working, and why. What are the mechanisms that explain why something is working or not? So, of course, we would like to weigh these two answers in the real world. And I would say that in our experience, probably fail because of a linear combination of these two answers, right? And probably the first short answer is much more important than the second, okay? So you would expect that even though you have the best design and the most rigorous evidence of whether a policy worked or not, even though you know what are the specific mechanisms to redesign that policy in the future, even though you have the best possible evidence, if that evidence is not attractive for the interests of those who participate in the political cycle, then that evidence is going to be thrown out. Okay, so of course this is a combination, and in the ideal world we would like to integrate these two processes together. Okay, so we as a researchers should try to convince policymakers and politicians in general why it's important to evaluate those policies, but more importantly, how can we implement this evaluation process in a way that is viable politically. Okay.
Raimundo,
sorry.
Raimundo,
Yep.
may I interrupt for just a second? We have an interesting question from Humberto from Costa Rica. And I know we could wait until the end of the presentation, but I felt that it's somewhat related to what you were discussing right now. So the question is from Humberto, he's saying, is it possible that part of the failure of public policies is also due to problems in Latin America? To train good evaluators of public policies, for example, we have a lot of theory from the book from Professor Gertler, but putting it into practice in the field becomes complicated, a labyrinth, where we do not know if we're doing it well. This also explains weaknesses in key control institutions, such as supreme audit institutions and evaluation agencies. So I was wondering if maybe if that would probably fit what you were discussing right a few seconds ago. So if you would like to comment on that, maybe.
Yeah, thank you, Humberto, for that question. I think it's very related what we are discussing right now. We need to convince the political system, especially the policymakers and those who take the decisions above them, why evaluating is important. As I said before, if we are able to produce the best possible evidence, but that evidence is not attractive for the political interest, then we would have lose our time. Okay. Now, this is not a simple game, right? I mean, you would like to provide some guidance to policymakers, but you do not want to appear as you want to get your own prize by yourself, right? You want to share that prize with the others, right? Now you need to make the policymaker to feel that this new prize, this new successful policy is because of them and not of you, right? And that's, of course, require other type of skills that are important. Paul is raising his hand, probably saying something more important than that.
Yeah, well, not more important, but I actually kind of disagree on the facts, Humberto, as you state them. So when I was at the World Bank from 2004 to 2006, that's when I met Raimundo, who was a young techero at that point. When I was invited to the World Bank, I was asked to figure out how do we generate evidence from bank operations in human development. And so we did a diagnostic and we realized there was very little evaluation going on. And what did we need to do? Well, we needed to train World Bank staff members in evaluation. We needed to train country counterparts in evaluation, and we needed to sensitize local government decision makers on how to use evidence. Since then, and then when I would go into a country, the idea that we would do prospective evaluation or we needed a control group or we should randomize was just a battle. Since then, we probably, through just the World Bank alone, not to mention the BEAD and other organizations that are doing these things, have probably trained about 10,000 people in Latin America. There have been large numbers of young people who've gone on and got master's degree with the capability of doing these things. And in certainly every middle income country, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, there are universities with local academics who know how to do these things and do it well. Governments like Chile, they have a whole office in DPRESS that knows how to do it. Colombia in Planeación, in Peru, in Mides, in Mexico, they have a whole agency, Conoval. So I actually think that there's lots of capacity within Latin America to do this. Even if your country, let's say you're Guatemala, you can go to Mexico or another place and get the expertise. Or my preference is you hire very expensive consultants from the University of California. So I think the expertise is there. And it's hard, but it wasn't the way it was 15 years ago.
just to complement your answer, Paul, which I agree with, is that many times researchers are trained on how to implement a good research design, right? However, in practice, for that research design to be successful and then scale up to a successful policy, you need to engage with politics. We as researchers need to be more willing to talk with the world of policymakers. There the story is different. We do know how to design a good research, right? We do know maybe to identify the right question. But if we do not train ourselves in how to engage politics on the importance of evaluating policies and try to convince them that we can work together, then our efforts are not going to be that impactful as we would like. Okay, so that just to complement, that's my view at least. And there are many ways that you can that you can convince politicians, not only with the good idea that you can have in mind. You may have a very good idea of how to redesign a given program, for example. Or also you can have a very good idea of the easy way to get good results that can popularize the interests of these politicians, right? However, there are other ways that are more, have a longer term, if you want, in order to get matured, which is, for example, offering capacity buildings. Okay, so you can start working with institutions and try to train people who work in those public services on how evaluation work. What are the main limitations, either practicals or theoreticals? And then when you start to create a relationship with those services, you start to, in a way, see a sort of culture of evaluation within services. And that can happen and in a successful way in some public services within Chilean government, at least. That's my experience. And I know it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. Many times you fail. There is a new government coming now. I don't know if they're equally convinced than those people that I tried to convince in the past 4 years. But sometimes that cultural norm of the importance of evaluation persists in this kind of institution. And if you are lucky, then your work it was worth it. So that's one point that I think is it seems to be costly, but sometimes it's less costly than appears to be. Now, and why that point is so important, and let me highlight the last point of this slide. If you wanna institutionalize the evaluation process, if you want to install a sort of system within a public service, a system of evaluation, where every policy that is designed has to pass through an implementation evaluation, through a final results evaluation, and then needs to pass through a reformulation process. If you want to install that kind of system within a public system, a public service, or even within a government overall, then you need to change the cultural norms that govern the minds of people who work in those systems, right? And in order to do that, you need to work with them for long years, many months, many years working together to build confidence with them. So at the end of the day, when you can show them that your product is very valuable, then they trust again on you, and you start to change the internal culture of those services. Only that way, we could be able to build an institutionalized process of evaluation that will persist over time, government by government. I know that sounds very idealistic, very difficult to implement in practice, but you never know. I mean, if you are persistent, at least I would like to aspire to be that influential if it's possible. I'm not sure if I'm going to success on that, of course. Okay, and just to finish this presentation, and we would be happy to receive more questions if you have. I think, highlighting this point of institutionalizing the evidence-based policy, which we would consider as the final goal of all this discussion, or of all this process of trying to convince politicians of why it's so important to evaluate. That takes some time, and there are some key inputs that I think Paul and his experience working with Coneval in Mexico could be very valuable for this debate. So Paul, if you can tell us a little bit, how was that process?
Why don't we do this, Raimundo? I think we've gone on for more than an hour right now. Why don't we just say that the type of institutionalization that you're talking about happened in Mexico with this independent agency created by Mexico's Congress called Coneval, and it worked very well as long as the politicians were interested. The current government, which is uninterested in evaluation or using evidence, really has shut down most evaluation. But I think it'd be really good to get comments from everybody else rather than spend 10 minutes or 15 minutes on Coneval.
Okay, anyone have any comments, any question?
Or maybe I was wrong.
No, I think it's right. I mean, we have received a couple of questions here. Angelica Pavez says, thank you for the conversation, very interesting. I have also been researching public policy failures. I agree with the importance of evaluation, but that evaluation is not only technical or economic, but it is also a political or social context evaluation. Oh, I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
Angelica Pavez also says, there is a certain theme on the part of the academy, perhaps of underestimating the tremendous importance of the political and knowing how to navigate in these two worlds, such as the cases you have presented. Could be, yeah. If there is no more question, let me finish with, I guess, 2 minutes, just to wrap up on what can we do as researchers to help the new government and the actual evidence-based policy system that is operating through the press in the current government. The press has made a lot of effort to institutionalize the process of evaluation of public policy and programs across all the public services within the state. Okay, and this effort is not new. There is some culture of evaluation in Chile that is very strong, and I would say that every year is more rigorous than the previous one, and that's good news. Okay, indeed, today, for example, there exists a Unidad de Política Experimental that basically put money on the table for researchers who wants to evaluate interesting policy programs that are implemented by the government, so that can generate experimental evidence on what works and what doesn't, and why, and how to improve the public policies within the government. And this is not the only methodology that they use. They also use quasi-experimental methodologies in order to evaluate many other programs across the states, and that's of course very good news. Now, there are some pending challenges that I would like to raise here. The first one is the institutional autonomy. Okay, so for example, in the case of Mexico, Coneval was an institution that operates independently of the actual government in charge of the country, and that's very important because that gives some independency on who choose what to evaluate, who evaluate what. I mean, this process of evaluation is pretty much disattached from the government interest. I'm not sure that that's the case of the press currently. And ideally, I think one way to push in order to institutionalize this evidence-based policy system in the Chilean government is trying to generate more autonomy at the institutional level. And finally, also increase the number of evaluation. I think that's important. And ideally, rigorous evaluation, that means using the gold standard methods to identify causal effects of the policies. I think all that it will add to the cumulative process of generating knowledge. If you know, for example, what's the impact of one program in one site, that could also be informative of how a similar programs working in a different site. So as long as you start to increase the number of evidence-based policies that are operating in the system, then you gain some sort of economies of scale that helps you to learn in a more productive way. Okay? And a final note on scale up, I think there are many policies that could work in a sort of laboratory, in a sort of pilot that may work differently when you scale up, because precisely economies of scales or other kind of interactions. And that's also important to evaluate at some point, and we as researchers should also try to push in that direction. I'm not sure if I'm taking more time, probably yes, that I should, but in case you have any question or comments, I'm happy to receive them. I'm sure Paul as well, you can write to our emails. I'm happy to continue this conversation in a different setting. So thank you very much.
And please feel free to ask questions in English or in Spanish. Siéntanse libres de hacer preguntas, ya sea en inglés o en español, si es que hay alguna inquietud que haya quedado pendiente. Okay, it seems that maybe we don't have any additional questions. Maybe I do have one question, hopefully short. So should one move towards a system where every initiative is before implementation goes through a process like this, where you have maybe piloting and then evaluation, and then you define what to do, and clearly there will be situations where I'm thinking like when you have like national emergencies where you don't have the luxury to wait, but probably there are a lot of other situations in which that's not true, and where you can actually have more time and you can do things perhaps in a more serious way. So how do you see the implementation of maybe some of the recommendations that you have? Is this an approach that should be used for pretty much every policy, for some policies? How to discriminate between them? If it makes sense, what I'm asking. This is clearly not my field of expertise, but I found the discussion very interesting. So maybe if you can tell me if this question makes sense or your reaction.
So let me take a first crack at this, Raimundo. It would be, I think, too expensive and take up too many human resources to evaluate every program. And so how do we prioritize where evaluation is most useful? So first of all, ex ante evaluation, is there a theory of change? Does it seem reasonable? Is always worth doing. Ex post evaluation, or evaluation of impact with data collection and things like that. I think it's in the interest of government to prioritize a knowledge agenda. One is, does the program take up a large share of my budget and cover a large number of people? Knowing it works versus nothing, or knowing what the best alternatives are, has a huge benefit cost advantage. Second, have we evaluated this type of program in Chile in the past or with a similar population? Well, then maybe it's not as much of a imperative. And then there are other programs where it's cheap and we have to do it quickly, like simple information campaigns about breastfeeding, or information campaigns about public health hazards, or you should vote. Those are one-time, very inexpensive things. It doesn't pay to do massive pilots. So when I work with governments, organizations like DPRESS or Carnival, I ask them to list their budget, their programs, identify what their budget is for evaluation and what their human resources are to do it, and then create priorities based on what's going to be most useful for policy. And typically it comes down to, how many people, how much money comes out of my budget, and what do we already know about this type of program?
Thank you, Paul. We have a couple of additional questions that written in the chat. Maybe I can read the first one. This one about the criminal reform. Walker Vasquez is saying the criminal reform failed or was not the best in Chile, but the trend is throughout Latin America that already has this criminal reform due to the increasing crime at the global level. Can you say that this is a collective failure? Can we say that the criminal reform across Latin America is a collective failure? I guess it's a question.
Maybe I can pick that one. I wouldn't say that it is a collective failure. Of course, government can learn of what other governments have done well in the past. But in this particular topic, criminal reforms, it is difficult to say whether those reforms have succeeded or not. I mean, you need to define very well which are the outcome of interest that you're evaluating, first of all. And secondly, the differences in terms of the level of crimes that you have across different countries could explain why some reforms fail very much in some contexts and not very much in others. I agree that this topic is a bit sensitive in the sense that the reality is quite different. Even though all countries are part of Latin America, crime in Chile and in Uruguay are totally different with the case of Colombia, for example. And the same we can say with Brazil. So in that sense, saying that this is a collective failure would imply that all these countries were facing exactly the same problems. And I think that's not the case. Every country is context specific, and the reform should apply to those contexts specifically. So that's my view of this. Of course, you can learn from what happened in the experience of different countries, but this is not a copy-paste system of policies. I do not believe on that, at least.
There is another question. Ingrid Cortez is saying, hi, thanks for the talk. I would like to know, what do you think about the negative impact that resistance to change may have in the success of public policies that in general are not very innovative in terms of technologies and processes? So I guess the question is pretty much about resistance to change and how that affects public policies in your view.
Well, it affects a lot. It affects a lot, and especially because not only, I mean, when you talk with people within a public service that have run with a lot of effort their program, they feel that the program is of their own, and change their view of what should we do in order to improve the program is very difficult, and that's one of the reasons why there is a lot of resistance. Because sometimes policymakers get in love with their own programs. This also happens in academia when researchers get in love with their own papers, and the papers are not good. So in that sense, you will also have some level of resistance when you feel that what you have in hand pertains to you and not to the intended population that you want to help, right? And that happened a lot. It's a real problem. It's a sort of a cultural norm that's governed the relationship within the public services. No one wants to be evaluated because the cost that would imply on their own reputation. And this is a long-term topic. I mean, I would love to have dedicated more time to talk about this because I know it is very important, but I'm not sure we have enough time to do it. So just to answer Ingrid Cortez' question, yes, I do believe that resistance to change is one of the factors why public policies fail in the long run, because they don't want to be evaluated.
It's one of the reasons why we have elections.
Yeah. In some way, yes, I agree.
We have one more question from Enrique Pasten. Do you think it is important to have a good database to collect real needs of the population when you try to be effective with a particular policy? How complicated should it be to implement it?
You know, in democratic societies, as nowadays is becoming our country, more and more democratic, I think it's a consensus. It should be a consensus within the political system and also within the policymakers community that we should start to incorporate and integrate communities in the discussion of the design. Right? So more than creating a database that collect the real necessities, we need to invite people to the same table than you and start talking about what are their necessities, why do they think that the program that we are delivering is not working as they expected, what do they think should change about the programs, what are the type of policies that should be incorporated. I mean, there are a lot of knowledge in the real beneficiaries of public policies that we as researchers and also as policymakers are not considering when designing public policy. And part of the failure is not because of we are not collecting that information in a database, but it's because we are not making people to feel part of the political process that design the policies. I think I am a believer that way of operating could be inefficient in the short run, but in the long run, when you need to create policies that persist successfully over time, those kind of actions are very cost effective. That's my view. I don't know if you, Paul, think the same.
No, I'm in complete agreement.
Okay, so it's already 8:15 p.m., a little bit 2 minutes after that here in Chile. It's probably much earlier in California anyway, but we would like to thank once again. We feel very fortunate, very lucky to have had a chance to get this dialogue, this discussion on public policies, why they may fail, what are some of the reasons why they not always succeed. And it was really, really very insightful to listen to the discussion that both you, Raimundo and Paul basically had today. So thank you very much to our speakers. And of course, thanks to all the attendees, everyone in the audience today for joining us in this webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.